polling. And so, yeah, over the last few days, especially, we were coming off of the Iowa and New Hampshire. We saw this huge drop in Biden's projected vote share in South Carolina, and Sanders performing quite well. But over the last sort of week, that trend has very much reversed itself, as you see that sharp spike in Biden's vote share, where now he's pretty much just under 40%. Hasn't really been able to break that threshold in many polls. There have been a few where he has, but in the aggregate, kind of just in the mid to high 30% range, where Sanders seems to have plateaued at 20% of the vote share. One thing I would point out is just on the average of polls, we are demonstrating sort of a downward trajectory for Tom Steyer. And he had some good polls even in December. I believe there was a Fox News poll that was really the first that had him in the mid to high teens, which that was a surprise to everybody paying attention, because Tom Steyer was really not breaking 10% anywhere. He was lucky to break 5% anywhere. However, it seems like Steyer's growth has just really plateaued, and it looks like Biden might be able to benefit from that. And so we'll kind of see what this means on election night, but I wouldn't be surprised if Biden is really where, if we think about it in lanes, which we probably don't want to do, but if we think about it in lanes, Biden might be coalescing the so-called moderate lane a little bit more here than he was able to do in Iowa and New Hampshire.
When you guys look at polling like this and you see these swings, I mean, what does that tell you about the state of the race, or what potential voters are telling pollsters in terms of either commitment or just the overall volatility of the race?
So presidential primaries, I think, are unlike any other dynamic in American politics. Polling in general is somewhat of a lagged snapshot, right? But usually the lag is not sufficient to really matter unless it's in the middle of a big event or something like that. When it comes to presidential primaries, there's a ton of strategic voting, especially when you have a field like this where we're still at 8 candidates and we're going into the 4th state. There's a lot of strategic voting. There's a lot of that sort of momentum effect. Who people talking about affects who people vote for in the coming days. So if you have a poll out on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you put it out on Saturday, that information might already be a little bit, behind the times. And so usually what I look at in the days before a primary or a caucus is the trend line. Usually, whatever the trend line is, if you sort of keep applying it as if it was 2 days behind and it was going to keep going unless there's some sort of event that happens, that ends up happening in the primary. So in other words, if you see that Klobuchar is rising in the polls, as she was in New Hampshire, she ends up going from high single digits or low double digits to about 15% going into New Hampshire. She ends up getting close to 20% of the vote. Buttigieg in Iowa had a bit of a momentum boost. I think most polls on the last couple of days had him at about 21, 22%, and he ends up with 25 or 26% of the vote. So those sorts of effects, I think, are what I look at. And what I see here is Tom Steyer going down, Bernie holding steady, and Joe Biden going up. And so if I had to sort of guess what ends up happening based off this polling, I would imagine that Joe Biden outperforms his polls by a little bit. I would guess that Steyer underperforms his polls by a little bit, and the other candidates sort of hold steady.
And we saw that with Steyer in Nevada as well. There were some polls showing him in sort of third place and popping up when Biden slumped in another state where Bloomberg wasn't an option. He's almost sort of like the third party candidate, that they poll better than they actually perform. Podcool, what are you looking at? What's this telling you? Sort of the same thing. I think we all agree Biden's definitely benefited from his second place finish in Nevada, distant second place, but still second place. And when you've been coming in fourth and fifth, any second's good. And also of a good debate. I mean, that's maybe the story of this is the debates and what they're doing to polling, especially when there's no early voting.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, in New Hampshire, that was almost certainly the case, and it's true. It was true both in the polling, if we look at again the Klobuchar case in New Hampshire, but then also we've seen it in fundraising. And so Elizabeth Warren had the good debate last week. And she, at least her campaign was reporting that she had raised quite a bit of money off of that, not unlike Klobuchar the week before. But no, yeah, I mean, Joe Biden had a good debate earlier in the week. Now again, we're grading that on the Biden scale. So he had a good debate for Joe Biden. Whether or not Democratic primary voters think he had an overall good debate, that I think is maybe a broader question. But no, based on his previous performances, I think he did everything that he had to do to demonstrate that he could be a strong candidate in the moderate lane. And yeah, I mean, we could do a 4-hour one of these episodes just talking about some of the nuances in polling and that sort of thing. But I think overall, I would echo what Alex is saying, how overall we want to look at some of the trend lines. I don't know if I would necessarily expect one of the candidates to underperform and another one to overperform, just to extrapolate that trend line. But in broad swaths, this does tell us a little bit about where the race is going and some of the things we could expect. And yeah, even though a week ago we were talking about how Nevada is a difficult state to poll, it seemed to be that the polling did a pretty good job. And so we have no real reason to expect in South Carolina, in polling the Democratic primary electorate, that the polls would be inaccurate. But again, that is going to be an overall question, is just how are the polls doing so far? And I know we want to get to forecasting, but we could quickly look at the national polling perspective. And I think the line that most of us maybe want to pay attention to here is Bloomberg. And so I think one of the questions is whether or not Bloomberg peaked. And I think one of the things we're going to see, or one of the things we're going to want to look for in some of the national polling that comes out over the next few days, is whether or not Biden could steal some of that Bloomberg perspective. I know, or some of that vote share. Earlier in the week, there were some polls out of YouGov that were demonstrating that Bloomberg supporters, they were most likely to also be considering Joe Biden. That is, a majority of Bloomberg supporters were also considering voting for Joe Biden. And so it could be that if Joe Biden has a good night on South Carolina, that maybe some of those Bloomberg voters in Super Tuesday states are going to end up voting for Joe Biden as sort of the anti-Bernie candidate after all. Still an open question, obviously, and as we mentioned, there are some other idiosyncrasies, namely with absentee and early voting, that need to be considered. But I don't know if I'd count Joe Biden out yet. What do you guys think about the national polling picture as before we switch over to forecasting?
The thing that strikes me the most is Bernie's trend over the last month or two. So I'll do my favorite thing ever that Podcool loves. I will compare this to Donald Trump. So in 2016, Donald Trump was stuck in the mid-20s polling wise for a while. But once he picked up momentum from winning primaries, he started to crack through sort of the barriers that conventional wisdom said he wouldn't be able to crack through, right? So first he jumped from the mid-20s into the low 30s, then he cracked into the 40s, and then ultimately by the end of it, he had support from the majority of national Republicans. Bernie seemed stuck for a while in the teens or low 20s. And then once the primaries started, he seemed to crack 30, especially essentially the peak was right after Nevada. He cracked 30 for the first time, and that was seen as significant. Since then, it's gone down, but this is only based off of a week's worth of polling, and so it could just be a temporary blip as he continues his rise up into the 30s and 40s, or it could be an actual significant shift where he was in line to sort of consolidate support among Democrats, but has since then faltered. So that'll be interesting to see as we get into Super Tuesday where his number is, because I think that will affect a few things on Super Tuesday.
Yeah,